and then we'll get going, just so everybody knows.
Hi.
See my mom on here. Hi, Mom.
All right, hi Mom, if you watch this later, because you told me to send you a link.
That's right.
Family of immigrants are very interested in this panel.
You can watch it live on YouTube. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start. So for those of you who haven't joined us before, and for those of you who are joining again, welcome again to Design at Large for the spring quarter here. It's both a class and as well as a community event, I'd say. So it's a nice venue where we have both students and people from local and local communities, UCSD, and also from around the country and sometimes internationally. Today we have a really exciting panel. We are going to be talking today about, the title is Surveillance, Migration, and Civil Rights in the Age of a Global Pandemic. And we have a panel of 2 people, plus Lily Irani is going to be moderating for us. And before I dig into it a little anymore, I want to say that we're recording this. It's going on to, it'll be posted on the Design Lab website afterwards, so I needed to let you know. And also we're going to be having the panel that's going to be open to questions throughout. So we'll be asking that you can either raise your hand in the, there's a little blue hand that goes up if you want to get called on. We're also going to be asking you to turn on your mic, and if you're comfortable with it, to have your camera on as well when you're asking the question. And we're happy also for you to have your videos on a little bit as well beyond that. So microphones off unless you're asking a question, because then it gets too confusing, but the video can go on or off as you choose. So I'm going to introduce Lily Irani. She's the panel moderator for today. Lily Irani is an associate professor of communication and science studies here at UCSD. I know her through her service as faculty in the design lab, and she's also faculty at the Institute for Practical Ethics, the program in critical gender studies, and sits on the academic advisory board of AI Now at the New York University, NYU. She is author of a really recent book, came out in 2019, and winner of the 2019 Diana Forsyth Prize for Feminist Anthropological Research on Work, Science, or Technology. And I know her for her exciting involvement in so many projects that we're working on. So welcome, Lily, and thank you.
Thank you, Colleen, for this amazing intro, and thank you to Colleen and Deborah for organizing Design at Large this quarter. It's really exciting to see Design at Large both include familiar faces from UCSD, but then also friends from, I think, all over the US, but also all over the world. I see folks I haven't seen for a long time here. So thank you for being here today. Today, as we tackle surveillance and migration and civil rights, we're going to be tackling a topic that can feel much larger than what design can deal with. You know, this is Design at Large. The Design Lab at UCSD is a program where we teach about human-centered design, how to incorporate human needs into the technological systems that we build. But what we're going to be learning about today and kind of really grappling with is these systems are the product of many, many designs. They are assembled together into really large machines, and so one of the things we'll be thinking about is what can we bring as designers, but then in what ways do we need to learn it to work in more ways than just design, as organizers, as activists, as analysts, as people who are taking care of our neighbors. So so don't get overwhelmed. We're going to be learning a lot today, but we're going to take one step at a time in understanding how we can take what we know and what we can contribute to these issues, and we're going to make the road as we walk on it. So with that, I also wanted to start with a land acknowledgement, because when we talk about migration, we also have to recognize that people have migrated and moved around for a very long time, but also those processes have been met with settlement and violence. So I wanted to acknowledge today that the land that many of us here who are in the San Diego area are gathered on is traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. I want to pay respects to the citizens of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to these ancestral lands. So thank you everybody for being here. I wanted to start with a little bit of an introduction of our panelists, Jacinta Gonzalez and Ryan Mack. Jacinta is a senior campaign organizer with Mi Gente, and she's based in Phoenix, Arizona. Previously, she worked at Poder in Mexico, organizing the Rios Sonora River Basin committees against water contamination by the mining industry. And with Mi Gente, Jacinta, I've come across Jacinta's work as one of the leading voices in the movement dubbed #NoTech4ICE. There are many powerful voices, many powerful organizations associated with this movement. Science for the People, Tech Worker Coalition. Mi Gente is also one of them that has been pushing that. NoTech4ICE is a movement of workers in the tech industry who organize so that the systems they build do not contribute to the human rights crises we see at our border. Ryan Mack is a senior technology reporter in BuzzFeed News, and he's based in San Francisco, California. He covers the intersection of wealth and power in Silicon Valley and has broken stories on companies, including Facebook, Google, and Tesla. And recently, he's been doing a lot of powerful work researching and studying the links that one particular face recognition company, ClearView, has to a lot of our governmental institutions. So we're really lucky to have both of them here. Thank you. And I wanted to open up the panel by letting you introduce yourselves by adding anything that you would like the audience to know about you, and also to help lay some groundwork for us. So I thought we could lay some groundwork recognizing that we have an audience of both kind of tech, engineering, and design people here. And we also have an audience of people who care about migration, civil rights, and are organizers. So why should people who care about design and tech ethics care about migration and civil rights? And why should people who care about migration and civil rights care about tech? So first, I'll turn to Jacinta.
Thank you so much, Lily, for the intro, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. We're really, really excited and think that, one, it's such an important moment for this conversation, but also I think given Ryan's really important research on ClearView and the very imminent threat that they pose to kind of exasperate the situation, which is already so hard, just kind of make it a really, really important moment. So thank you for creating this space. You know, as you said, my name is Jacinta. I'm a senior campaign organizer with Mi Gente. And Mi Gente is a national organization that is a political home for Latinx and Chicanx change makers that believe that we need a movement that isn't just pro-Latinx, but is also pro-Black, pro-women, pro-queer, pro-trans, because our communities are all of those things and many more. And so a lot of us that are part of Mi Gente have been doing work against deportations for a long time now, longer than some of us would like to admit. But through that process have really seen how tech and data companies are transforming immigration enforcement and really making it not only more hostile, not only more aggressive, but it's kind of expanding ICE's ability to not only surveil, detain, and deport, but also be able to start to act as a police force and a surveillance agency internationally. You know, this campaign, we didn't create it because we know a lot about tech or we care about tech issues. You know, to answer your question, why do we care? Because we have to, right? Our survival is on the line. And so for anyone who cares about policing, for anyone who cares about mass incarceration, for anyone who is watching immigration enforcement, tech and data are transforming the way that the government and the state is able to use violence against our communities to control them in many ways. And so we have no option but to be able to go in, in places where we've been fighting against cash bail, now we have to fight against algorithms. In places where we've been fighting against cages, electronic shackles or ankle monitors are being positioned as alternatives. When we think about immigration and deportations, surveillance is becoming something that is not only affecting folks that are coming to this country, but everyone at large. So I think we just kind of have to. And for folks that are thinking about design, why is this important? We're kind of the in real life scenario of some of these hypothetical ethical conversations that people are talking about when they talk about data or when they're talking about function. At the end of the day, we can say, well, that won't happen. But we are in a political moment where we have an administration that has targeted immigrants, has a police force of over 20,000 agents that are going after everyone. And they have unlimited surveillance capabilities that are being designed by some of our students in many campuses like yours. So it's time that we actually start to listen to people who are directly impacted by these things, pay attention to how these tools are being used in real life. And from there, we can actually come up with solutions and movements that can change things. So we kind of just have to, this is the conversation of the day and the place where we have to start to dig into ways of dismantling the types of power structures that are keeping our people down.
Should I go?
Sorry about that. Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you. Ryan.
Sure. So thanks for the intro, Lily, and great intro, Jacinta, as well. My name is Ryan Mack. I'm a reporter, senior tech reporter with BuzzFeed News. I've worked here for about 3 years. Before that was at Forbes magazine for about 5 years. With regards to the question about why tech should care about migration, I mean, you have an industry that was built on the back of migrants and immigrants. So many of the big companies here in Silicon Valley have been built by migrants. I think of something like Sergey Brin, for example, came from Russia, who protested back in 2016 when they started to close the border down to certain groups. And I think that's one of the reasons why people should care about migration when you're working at a place like Facebook or Google. And you got to kind of think about the history of Silicon Valley and how this place got built up. Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it.
Okay. All right. So maybe just to kind of help us understand the issue, Jacinta, could you tell us about how do people end up undocumented and how old is this problem? You mentioned this administration, but my understanding is that, you can go back to the previous administration, you can go back 50 years ago to work programs in the US, you can go back 100 years. So could you give a sense of that?
Sure. I mean, it's no secret, and I'm sure a lot of folks that are watching this webinar have a lot of ample knowledge around history of how migration patterns have affected this country. But whether it's been this country has always had a very racialized approach, a race-based approach to migration that has been incredibly destructive and harmful in many, many ways. And so we know that right now we have, close to 12 million people that in some way, shape, or form are undocumented. Some of them, came here 20 years ago. Some of them recently crossed and lost their asylum hearings. Some of them came on visas and stayed. The ways and the paths that people get to a place where they are undocumented are multiple, but the system is so concentrated in not giving people a way to be able to regularize their status that really what we've created is just a huge police force that can go after them. And so this approach in terms of putting enforcement first and allowing people a path to citizenship later has been around for a very long time, right? That's why we saw record of numbers of deportations under administrations like Obama. But what we're seeing now is kind of an escalation of that machinery that has been built for many, many decades. And so ICE agents have always had to figure out ways of targeting people because they have only a certain number of agents. They have the mission of trying to deport as many people as they can. And so for a long time, their allies in this were local police departments, right, and local jails. And that's why we saw a lot of racial profiling by police, a lot of more people being picked up for different types of citations. And this was a pipeline was being created from local police enforcement to deportation. But over time, I said, well, we want more. And so on top of this, what they're now doing is building up with private contractors and private companies to create different tools or different dragnets to get more people who they have identified as undocumented and put them into deportation proceedings.
That's super helpful. So maybe this is a question for both of you as a follow-up. How has tech changed this process that's been part of our history as a country? Maybe, do you want to, maybe Jacinta, you can go first, and then Ryan?
Sure. I mean, I think we're starting to track how it's changing based on the stories that we're hearing on the ground. So if you talk to a lot of people, folks will start to tell you what we've been seeing under this administration is more and more raids, right? That means more and more workplace raids. They're up, like workplace investigations are up 700% under this investigation, or sometimes they're community raids where ICE is literally going door to door, picking people up. We'll talk a little bit more about this later as we talk about ClearView. And so what ICE is doing is that ICE is using all of this data and technology to fine tune those raids to be able to go and locate people. So we started to ask questions just because people would ask us, like, how did ICE get this address? I've never gotten a ticket. I've never had any contact with the police. How did they know this is where I lived? Or people would ask us, how did they know he was my cousin, right? Just questions that were kind of really hard for folks to understand, just going off of public information. But once you start to think about how data brokers could sell information to data analysts that could then use this for ICE, you start to paint a clearer picture of how ICE is using people's medical bills, people's phone records, you know, whether it's they're using different technology to be able to use the location tracking. So we know that they actually have a lot more tools in their tool belt to be able to go after people, and that in that way be able to create more fear, create more anxiety in communities, but then also be able to up their deportation numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's right. I mean, you think of like the massive digital footprints that people have now, whether that's, I mean, something as simple as posting a Facebook photo or an Instagram photo or tagging themselves on LinkedIn or whatever, or Foursquare if they use that still. And how things are used, how tools like Palantir are deployed for ICE and work with ICE. In terms of my reporting with ClearView, it kind of really isn't known how specifically they were using it, but the fact that they were using it at all is really concerning, considering the company has never really disclosed its client list until we kind of were able to see that and report on that. And so some of the tools that ICE is using, we actually still don't have a clue about. I mean, we wouldn't have had an idea about whether or not they were using ClearView until we reported that out in February. So I think a lot of it remains to be seen as well.
Yeah, actually, could I ask you to talk about what are data brokers and what's ClearView? We haven't really talked about that with the audience.
I'll take data brokers if you take ClearView.
Sounds good. Okay.
I want to invite our guests to this Design at Large to start using the chat as well for questions that they might want to put forth. And Lily, are we ready to open it up for raising hands and that sort of thing? Or you want to wait a little bit?
If you have questions about things that you want to like clarify, I'm going to watch the questions and then kind of bring those into the flow of our conversation.
Great,
and
thank you.
Time at the end for raising hands.
Thank you,
Sorry
Lila.
about that. Yeah, thanks.
So data brokers, you know, when we really think about data, the value that data has and how it's being bought and sold on the global economy is growing and growing and growing, right? It was worth over $1 trillion last year. Like you just really can see the numbers ballooning up and more and more. And so data brokers are kind of these entities that are literally buying people's data and then selling it to somebody else. So when we think about all of the apps that we use, when we think about all of the bills, when we think of all of the things that are constantly creating data and information on us, how does that get into the hands, for example, of someone like ICE? They rely on data brokers to buy the information and then sell it to them. And so what we've been seeing is there's, you know, some of the main data brokers for ICE and companies like Palantir are companies like Thomson Reuters or RELX, right, LexisNexis. So, you know, folks can go to Mijente's Twitter. We have a video that we've been sharing out about how Thomson Reuters works as a data broker, because we know that they have their general meeting, right, where shareholders are going to be able to vote on a shareholder proposal against their contracts with ICE on June 3rd. So this issue of data brokers is really, really important and really talks about how the pipeline of everywhere from like when you get your cable bill to having it be part of the way that ICE proves your address, data brokers are a key part of being able to sell and buy that information.
Cool. I'm going to ClearView now. ClearView is was a little known company that we have been reporting on. I would say I probably started looking at it back in June of last year. But it was this little known startup that claims to have basically created a database of more than 3 billion photos that they've scraped from places like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Venmo, as well as YouTube and a lot of like millions of other websites around the web. And they've taken that database of photos and used that to train a facial recognition system. So that system, we found out later, is being sold to anyone from ICE to Macy's, the retail store, to the DHS or the FBI. And what they say is that their facial recognition is highly accurate, and it can basically identify anyone. You can take a photo of someone on the street or at a bar, and it can help, and that tool can help match them and identify them within seconds. In demos that we've seen from folks, you basically hold the camera up to someone, take their photo, and then it'll spit out photos that it scraped from the web. And that isn't just photos that maybe you've posted on Facebook or you've posted on Instagram, but maybe if you're in the background of something, or if you're in an old photo that you kind of forgot about that your grandma posted, they claim that they'll be able to find that. So yeah, that is ClearView. It was kind of unknown, and then a New York Times story broke their existence back in January, and we kind of followed up on that with some of our reporting.
So is it fair to say that if we have our photos on Facebook, we are contributing to the kinds of deportations that are happening right now?
I think it's a stretch, because I don't know if what specifically ICE is using it for. We do know that ICE has been using ClearView for certain things, particularly ERO, which is enforcement and removal operations. But I'm not clear as to specific examples of them using it to maybe deport someone. But yeah, if you've put your photos on Facebook and they're public and anyone can access them, then it's likely that they've been scraped and used to kind of train this algorithm that is spitting out, I guess, matches for ICE.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that you said that kind of caught my attention is that it's really hard to know what ICE is using, which technologies they're using, and how. In San Diego, that's actually been a really big challenge with surveillance technologies, and there's movements in many cities to get big surveillance ordinances that create transparency and accountability around the acquisition of this tech. How did you find out that ClearView was being used by ICE? Like, what do you have to go through as a journalist to help us as a public understand what happens with this tech in our lives?
So I'll start from the beginning. I mean, I got a tip about this company back in May, and for a lot of 2018, or May of last year, so a lot of 2018 I spent reporting on Facebook. Of course, Facebook in 2018 had the large Cambridge Analytica scandal. It had data mishaps left and right. And that was kind of the entry point in which I started kind of reporting on that company. Mm-hmm. And in following that, the following May 2019, around that time, I got a tip from someone who had gotten a demo of this app from a friend. And they were like, this thing is crazy. Like, I don't have many photos of myself online, but it was able to kind of locate me in the back of someone else's photo and surface me and other things. So I was like, this is very odd, because like I'd never heard of a facial recognition system that had basically culled from social networks to develop their kind of database. They told me the name. I couldn't find much on it. There was like this website that basically had nothing on it. Mm-hmm. They had no employees on LinkedIn. And so I kind of just kept it in the back of my mind. I had a couple Google alerts set up. And then in December, there was this kind of local news report from some Florida TV station. Basically someone that had been arrested in the robbery of I think it was like a home improvement store or something like that, stealing barbecues or something like that, had been identified using facial recognition software. And the report was like, oh, the tool that was used is something called ClearView AI. We have no idea what this is. And at that point, I was like, holy shit, this thing is actually being used by cops. Like, police forces are actually using it to arrest people and actually do actually work in solving cases. And at that point, I was like, okay, we need to actually move on this. We should start filing public records requests and trying to understand where these guys are operating. We kind of got beaten to the punch initially by the New York Times and Kashmir Hill, who is a great friend and a reporter. And she wrote the first story. She got an interview with the company in January, but we kind of followed up and kind of continued reporting. And eventually we were able to view basically their client list. We got this from a source. And that client list kind of disclosed that they had been working with more than 2,200 agencies, police forces, private companies, and had basically distributed this thing left and right. A lot of them using free trials, but like kind of without supervision. Like if you were a cop in the Little Rock, Arkansas Police Department, you could just sign up with your government email and get access to this facial recognition tool, which is crazy. And there was little oversight. Sometimes in cases, like commanding officers had no idea that their officers were even using it. The NYPD, for example, had no idea that it's like hundreds of cops within the force had signed up to use ClearView. And it was only after our story that they kind of realized that this thing was in use. And so, yeah, I think that was kind of really eye-opening for us. And since then, we've been kind of spending a lot of time focusing on that story.
Yeah. Is ClearView the main kind of biometrics and face recognition that we should be concerned about in the kind of violating civil rights of people who are here, or is the problem bigger?
I mean, there's dozens of facial recognition companies. I think what makes ClearView so unique is how blatant they are in terms of saying, we took your photos that you put on Facebook and Instagram. I don't think anyone has the expectation that when you post something to a Facebook or a Twitter or LinkedIn or Instagram or even YouTube, like that's going to be used, scraped and used against you to kind of build a facial recognition dragnet. I think that's not the expectation. But they've been incredibly blatant with it, to the extent where the CEO has said like he has a First Amendment right to do this. And it's kind of been this interesting argument that he's presented.
Legally admissible.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, they're being sued in multiple cases. So we'll see how that holds up.
Jacinta, do you want to chime in on that, or?
Well, I just feel like if we're starting to mention lawsuits, we should just dive in, because I'm also getting lost with some of the questions in the chat. But you know, I think part of the reason that we have a lot of it gets really difficult to figure out what accountability with these companies look like, because the legal frameworks that exist are completely insufficient at actually addressing the problem at hand. And so, like Ryan said, there are a couple of lawsuits, right? Like, for example, in Illinois, because Illinois has a pretty robust state law that would allow for something like this.
And can you explain that law briefly? Just for the audience, they might not know.
I can.
Go for it, Ryan. I was
just really quick, and then back to
Jacinta. There's too many attorneys on this panel to like mess it up, so I will let Ryan take that.
Sure. The Illinois law that is the Biometric Information Privacy Act. I think that's the acronym is BIPA. It's probably the strongest biometric data law that it's in existence. It's a state law. And ClearView has been sued under it multiple times. In fact, it's been kind of glommed together in this class action lawsuit. But it prevents private companies from using biometric data of individuals without their informed consent. So that has been, even in lawsuits in like New York, for example, that have been brought against ClearView, they've cited BIPA as the reason why they've taken Illinois residents and said, we're suing under this law. And that's what ClearView is kind of facing. But there is no federal biometric privacy law like that. And so people have been looking to Illinois as a kind of standard for that.
And so with that climate, you have states kind of trying to take their approach, but at a federal level, we don't have a ban on facial recognition technology. We don't have any sort of privacy laws. And then to make things even more complicated, a lot of these tools that are being sold to law enforcement they're actually very strategically saying that they're for investigation purposes and not to be used in court. And so we have this really tricky situation where ICE agents, other federal agencies obviously have access to the information to find you, but then the way that they proceed in court, they're able to cover up their tracks, able to proceed on their own terms. And then that means that there's no way of actually challenging it. And so these companies are literally a way for these federal agencies to go around any sort of constitutional protections. And that makes it even more difficult to figure out the way of doing that. So I know some folks are asking, well, can't we just buy the information and use it ourselves? I mean, I think one, there's like the ethical reasons of like how you get the information, but I also want to be very clear that we're talking about millions of dollars, right? So it's not like they buy the information from Thomson Reuters for, $100. It's like $50 million to constantly be bringing in information. And then it's hundreds millions more dollars for data analytics for companies like Palantir, and then much more money for companies like Amazon. So there is also just this perverse incentive to be able to continue to expand this, even though there's no legal framework to be able to contain it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work left to do, kind of on a policy level, not just a kind of I think there's some people who try to frame this in terms of algorithmic bias and technical approaches. How do those efforts to rein in tech fit, given the magnitude of the problem that you're talking about, kind of the fairness, accountability, transparency approaches? Like, for example, in California right now, there's a AB 2261 is a law that regulates face recognition. It's a bill that regulates face recognition. It has auditing requirements to make sure that the algorithm doesn't misidentify women or people of color more than the general population. But is that going to take us any step away as you see it, or is that just a distraction?
I don't know if they're distractions as much as they're just not. We're just so behind the 8 ball in terms of regulation, right? Like, we're thinking about regulating facial recognition technology, but you already have something like ClearView that's being used by more than 2,200 institutions on a daily basis, right? Like, and you kind of have lawmakers debating like whether or not like certain things, but it's like the cat's already out of the bag in many ways. So we're kind of relying on these like this PIPA law has been in existence for like, I think more than 10 years now. I forget the exact date of when it was published or passed, but yeah, I feel like it's I don't know if there's if there's like a legal way of addressing this, or a law way of addressing this, but.
I mean, I think the unfortunate reality is there's not a one law way of approaching this. We actually do have to reconfigure the way that we imagine data privacy, data ownership, and policing. I think at the end of the day, part of the reason why this is also a design issue, or why this is an important issue, is ICE as an agency is completely unregulated, completely rogue, and committing human rights abuses every day. And so we have to also understand that we have to approach it from that framework. At this point, we don't also have a lot of legal limitations to be able to bring accountability to that agency. And so that kind of complicates the issue when we can't untie the two or pretend that they don't have to do with each other, right? If we have an agency that is completely rogue, that is going to be deporting people without any due process, and you give these types of tools and technology, it's going to exacerbate the problem. So we can't come and regulate and kind of tinker with the fine lines of how and when they can use it. We actually have to look at the bigger picture of, if you have a policing agency with no accountability, with this type of access, this is the reality that we're going to have to face.
So that kind of brings us to the question of like, what are strategies for tackling this? I mean, obviously it's going to require a lot of different kinds of people and movements, but what are some of the places where you find hope, possibilities, ways forward? And that could be including your own work that you can share with the audience.
I mean, I think we're in a really, there's ways and ways where we talk about this, it starts to sound like a dystopian reality. People start to think like RoboCop is after them. It kind of becomes, it can escalate and become really, really scary really quickly. to me, it's very helpful to remember to keep yourself rooted in understanding that this is the next chapter of a very long story, right? You know, as we think about the history of policing, its roots to slavery, as we understand the violence that is linked to all of this, this is the next chapter, and we kind of have to look back at those movements and how people were able to tear down and break apart some of those structures to get inspiration of like where we're going. But I also think that this requires, you know, a movement that has a lot of different voices. You know, through No Tech for ICE, what's been really exciting for us is not only organizing with, you know, immigrants who are being attacked by ICE, but also working with students on different campuses that are fighting against recruitment from these companies or pushing back against these companies having presence in their classrooms with their professors. You know, working with investors, having unions in Canada file shareholder resolutions against data brokers is an exciting moment that I don't think we would have ever imagined just a year ago. You know, it really includes, you know, professors and academics that have said that they won't take sponsorships from these companies, you know, and it takes literally thousands of people showing up and protesting against these companies and thinking about what a corporate accountability strategy looks like, in addition to holding the government's feet to the fire for how they're treating immigrants in this moment. So I think it really is about being able to create different avenues for people to, you know, come out and speak about these things. You know, we've seen when tech workers themselves also participate in the fight, what can happen, right? There's many examples of what that can look like. And so we think that there's just, yeah, a lot more inspiring work that can happen there.
Can you say a little bit more about the tech workers and what can happen there? I mean, some people might not be familiar with what you mean.
Sure. I mean, I think we've seen in many companies, tech workers that oppose their company's contracts with ICE start to organize internally and push back. You know, sometimes that looks like collective sign-on letters. Sometimes that looks like being a whistleblower and going public. Sometimes that means, you know, trying to get more information about a contract internally and being able to talk about that with organizers. You know, we've seen is more and more we're having tech workers ask themselves these really difficult questions and figure out how to engage, and are connecting with movements too to be able to have more strength. But I think, you know, that has to be pushed even further. I think we also know that there's tons of retaliation for tech workers. We know that these companies, you know, make them sign NDAs and scare the Jesus out of them if they actually want to do stuff. And I think we just have to make sure that people are seeing the bravery of frontline communities that are facing the attacks from ICE to understand how themselves can get more inspired to take bolder steps.
So with frontline communities that are fighting ICE, especially at the, you know, in many of our border regions, how are they taking up tech as you know, as part of the battle that they're fighting? And how does it, you know, what are the challenges they face in taking on tech? What are the success stories and the strategies for bringing tech into a strategy that's about fighting for kind of rights of people in border regions?
I mean, the biggest challenge for this is, as Ryan was saying before, the first thing is to be able to even just find things and uncover them and expose them and be able to name and shame companies that are participating in this. You know, companies like Andril, companies that are trying to engage in sort of more a militarized border, are doing these contracts under the table, kind of trying to make sure that people don't know. So our first job as movements is to be able to expose it. But I think we really have to understand it's the history of it. You know, folks in border communities have been fighting against militarization of the border for a very, very long time. And this is kind of the next phase of that. So I think it again is like there's particular strategies that people take, but it's part of the ongoing process of being able to say that we actually have to reconfigure the way we think about borders, reconfigure the way that we think about border patrol, and actually be able to have a richer conversation about what actually keeps us safe. And that goes for, you know, politicians on both sides of the aisle. When Trump is talking about his brick and mortar wall, the first ones to clamor for a digital border wall are Democrats. And so I think we also have to be able to push back on all politicians for folks to see that any more dollars in the hands of CBP or ICE, any more contracts with these agencies is just going to further militarize and criminalize immigrants, militarize the border and criminalize immigrants, and won't actually help the problem at hand.
what you said about imagining other ways for us to be safe together seemed really powerful to me because, you know, for me, like having trained in computer science and then having been a designer, it's like by the time I got involved in something, it had already been framed as a technical problem. You know, like they're keeping people safe by measuring them or like giving them feedback, or the Android Ring devices that are now being, you know, pushed sometimes in collaboration with police. So, you know, for people who are working or learning at a nexus where things are already coming to you and it's already technical, like what advice do you have for opening up our imagination about like what are the other ways we should be feeling safe? What are the ways that like the technical problems like already kind of limiting me and pulling me into looking at the problem, perpetuating the problem in a particular way, if that makes sense?
I don't know if you want to try this one, Ryan. Like I have some thoughts, but I'm also not as technically savvy, so.
No, I don't know if yeah, I'll leave it to you, I guess.
I mean,
Can I say something about it?
Well, actually, let's hear from Jacinta first, Deborah, and then I'll let you chime in. Yeah.
Yeah, what I was just going to say is, I mean, I think one, if we're thinking about design or we're thinking about the system at hand, I think one, we have to look at our assumptions about the conditions. Because again, we also can imagine how should we redesign the Department of Homeland Security so that we don't dedicate a police force just to surveilling, detaining, and deporting immigrants, right? So that could be a design question that you could incorporate into the way that you approach the way that you're thinking of technology, is how is it reducing policing as opposed to enhancing or making there be more policing in the world. So I think that those are just some general questions or guidelines that I ask myself. Is this allowing for more freedom, or is this allowing for more information and control? But I also do think that people have to, you know, the concept or the identity of imagining yourself not as just as a designer, but also as a worker. At the end of the day, we know who is profiting off of these technologies. We know who is building these you know, organizations and these corporations. There's no coincidence between the connections between ClearView, AI, and white supremacist organizations that are literally building base for Trump. And so we have to also kind of be able to see things in that same light and understand that workers, as you're approaching a concept, you might just think of the little part that you're doing, but you're actually part of a bigger collective. And so if you're able to also conceptualize yourself as part of a big collective effort to change, then you're able to push things a little bit farther than just your little question that's in front of you.
I love what you said for a couple of reasons. One reason was when you talked about, you know, redesigning DHS not to have it be this kind of force for policing and control. I was thinking, okay, if I were a designer that somehow was involved in a project involving DHS, I would probably find that the client, if the client is DHS, would not be too happy with that. And so in order to actually design the kind of scope of transformation that a lot of times we at least aspire to learn as designers, you have to engage in politics, you have to engage in direct action, you have to engage in having resources moved, you have to engage in having your client want something different than what, you know, they're telling you they want. And so that's like, I felt like that was really powerful. For me, is, you know, something that was really missing from my background as a designer. So thank you for that. The other thing that really struck me is you mentioned that ClearView is run by white supremacists. So there's been a lot of reporting on ClearView as run by people who have had overt white supremacist postings on social media, participated in white supremacist kind of rallies in Charlottesville. You know, how should we be thinking about that? Is the answer that, well, it's bad that ClearView engineers are thinking about things politically because they're white supremacists and instead they should be neutral and unbiased? Or should we be thinking about the problem another way?
I can take that. I mean, yeah, so I guess the background for this is understanding the connections of the company to some of these folks that you're talking about. I think you're mentioning folks like Chuck Johnson, who was written about in a Huffington Post story, and we actually reported on as well. There was an individual that worked for the company that I think kind of espoused neo-Nazi viewpoints as well at one point, and was kind of let go after that HuffPost story disclose them. But like, yeah, I think it's fair to say it's not great that people espousing neo-Nazi views or white supremacist views are working at companies like this. I'm not clear how much that is affecting like the decision making, because right now we don't know how the CEO, I guess, what his viewpoints are at this point. He's kind of disavowed some of his statements that he made in the past. But yeah, it's not a great look that some of their employees, who I guess no longer work with them, have had these views while operating the company. Some of whom had pretty key roles, I guess, in sales positions and engineering positions as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that if you don't have anything you want to add, I can pull it. So Melissa in the queue asks question I think is kind of connected. You know, she's saying, you know, I think designers have a huge part to play, not just engineers and data scientists, because they set the conditions or framework for the products being built. Ethical design can translate to more ethical code. Yeah, what do you two think about that? Do you think that having more ethical designers will really transform the train that we're working on?
I think it can help, but I do think that, you know, some of your questions around when your client wants X, Y, or Z, that determines what you get to work on and how you get to design it and think about it. I mean, one good example to just kind of give in terms of ICE is like, ICE has all of this machinery to be able to compare all of your addresses from all of your bills, but they literally couldn't create an Excel spreadsheet to be able to track like separating children from their parents, right? It's like, you actually can really clearly see where their interest is and where their priorities are and where they're going to invest money in solutions and where they're actually saying, we don't want to invest money. And so I think it's important to just really hold that in terms of when we're thinking about design, because it's not just the design itself, it's how we're thinking about technology contributing to society and what we think of it as a problem, right? So if we think of immigrants as problems, so yeah, it might be that the connections to white supremacy don't mean that every decision you make is marked by that. But your whole entire premise of thinking that you should create something to target every undocumented immigrant in the US already is actually very ideological. And so I think we have to really kind of call that out and show that that is happening so that then we can really be able to get to it.
Yeah. We have a comment. Oh, sorry, Ryan, did you
want to... I was just going to say, like, I think designers should also think about like the unintended consequences of what they're making, right? Like if you're at Facebook or at Google, like, is something that you're designing now, could it be used down the line to do something else that you didn't intend? And that seems kind of obvious, but like, I don't think people that created Facebook photo sharing tool thought they'd one day be contributing to a database that's 3 billion photos strong and being used by ICE and CBP and the FBI to help capture people, you know? And so like, is it easy to like envision those like possibilities online? I don't know, but like, it's definitely something you should like wonder if you're designing products for the future. Like, can I be contributing to something that I don't intend to or don't want to down the line?
Yeah, we have a comment in the chat by Rick who talks about some people might not share some of the assumptions that we're making in talking about this, that I'm not gonna, that people share the assumption that immigration is something that should be allowed freely. I'm gonna rephrase it in a more respectful way. So I wanted to take a moment to kind of recognize that and to talk about why this is bigger than whether someone is documented or not. You know, as an Iranian American, like I have friends and family members who after 9/11, their name ends up on a no-fly list. They show up at the airport, they're not able to fly on the flight for which they have a ticket. A friend who's actually in Chicago, and there's this opaque system that regulates who gets to move and who doesn't, that targets people based on guesses that are made based on race. And in some ways, if immigration is in some ways a system where enforcement on the ground is based on guesses about who's good and who's evil, then we have this really thick technical stack that's making those guesses something that now we say algorithms can do, and they can do it faster, and we can speed up breaking people's lives apart based on those guesses. But so I don't think that this is a question. I don't think the conversation we're having is about whether immigration is good or bad. We're having a conversation about how the history of who culturally we guess is good or bad, which is the history of racism, is getting amplified through these technologies that are embedded in institutions that are meant to focus on people as dangerous to be deported. I don't know if anyone wants to, Ryan, I think they want to add something to that. I just felt like I had to kind of, speak to that, because there are probably people in the room who are thinking along those lines. And if you have anything that you want to say to folks who have that view, I'd welcome you to.
I mean, to me, it's a little bit, I've been trying to track the questions in the chat, so I haven't been able to get all the nuance of some of the comments and things, but did see some folks asking about, should we change immigration laws or immigration enforcement, which goes first? How do we kind of approach it? And it would be a very long webinar to talk about all of the attempts and the failed attempts for immigration reform in this country and in the last 20 or 30 years in terms of getting us to this place. But I do think that we just, as a society, have to take a big picture view of what we're doing and understand that we are contributing billions of dollars to creating up a surveillance dragnet and infrastructure that is going beyond just the issues of immigration at hand. It actually is around the role of government, the role of policing, and how we think about our information and our ability to participate in society. And so I do understand that folks might have different ideas around immigration. Obviously, I have my own, and Mi Gente has its positions that we've taken historically. But even if folks disagree with some of those issues around policy, there's still issues around how we're investing money and this relationship between private companies having all of our information with little to no accountability and sharing it with police agencies when there is no framework to actually make sure that there's a preservation of our fundamental rights. So even independently of the immigration issue, we have to look at that. But then we do have to look at this administration, what has been the role of immigration beyond just talking around, again, the nitty gritty around policy, and think about it's been used as a racialized way of being able to divide America to push a particular agenda, and to not only affect our democracy and our policing state, but also just our entire economy. So I think that we just have to think about it in broader terms.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I just wanted to add a story from, I think a friend of ours, Brian Hofer, with Secure Justice up in Northern California, told me this story about how he and his brother were driving down Highway 5 and they get pulled over by a police officer. The police officer pulls Brian out, slams him on the ground, handcuffs him, because he says that the car that Brian is driving is stolen. And it turns out that there's an automated license plate reader that the police officer was using. It misread the license plate. And so the police officer took that algorithm as the sign of certainty rather than going through a process of trying to establish, like, who does this car belong to? Who are you? Like, let's actually have a conversation. So this bigger issue about where resources are going, what kinds of technologies that are building, like, this is going to affect everybody's civil rights. It hits certain kinds of communities first because of the role they've had historically in the US. So with that, I wanted to open it up to questions and conversation with the audience. So I know there's been a lot of conversation and questions already in the chat. If I haven't woven it into the conversation, feel free to raise your hand and bring it up again for Jacinta and Ryan to tackle. Let's see.
I'm looking for raised hands. I'm not seeing any right now. So I think that I just wanted to comment really quickly. I'm thinking about my design students and how they go forth in thinking about all these kinds of issues as well as in their design practice. And I've been thinking, so they have to really think about what companies that they might work for. They have to really think about how they could be part of movements for these things, and maybe choosing what projects they work on or what projects that they don't work on. But one of the things that Lily just said that I thought was really interesting is the certainty, right? A lot of technology that we put out into the world has this sense that it's more certain, that it's more correct and more right than human decision making and things like that. And so oftentimes we do this thing like we overtrust a particular technology, right? And so maybe as designers, we can start to think about how do you design something so that people who use it have a more calibrated sense of how much they should trust a particular technology, or a calibrated sense of certainty with these technologies as well. And it's just I don't know, that was just an interesting thought for me.
If I could comment just to contextualize it also as part of the series. So there are a couple of things that came up. One is Jim Holland, who's one of the major people in the design lab, likes to remind people who design technology to think about what humans do before that technology was created. So a lot of times when we think of doing technology, we think like we're bringing in some new thing that can't be done. So there is a humility there about bringing back the human into the loop in a very important way. I think for this series, what we've seen is focusing a lot at what happens around UCSD in areas that are not typically considered design. But now we see, Lily Irani, who's one of the most prominent design thinkers at UCSD, to see her passion for issues that are related to it. And what she's chosen to do is bring something that's just outside UCSD, which is that we're a border town. And a lot of times people can go through a UCSD education without paying any attention to it. Mm-hmm. And just a plug for next week, we'll have Antoinette Mayer from Sandag, who will be able to, again, take us a little bit beyond what UCSD is doing and see how that relates to our lives.
It's wonderful. Did Sejal want to ask a question? Yeah. Or I could, okay, great.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for all of you for this great panel. So Ryan, this is actually a question for you. We've talked today a lot about accountability and holding policing agencies accountable. But one issue is just having the information. Like, for example, are my local police using ClearView? And so I was curious if you had any suggestions, aside from state open records requests, if there are ways that we can research or investigate whether, various policing entities are using ClearView.
Yeah, it's something we've been thinking about a lot as well. I mean, for now, I think the best way is probably public records requests into your local police departments, asking them for anything from contracts to emails. There's some pretty good federal and state contract databases that we've used to kind of show when ClearView does have contracts with local police agencies. The only issue with that is that most of the relationships that ClearView has with companies or taxpayer-funded groups is through these free trials. And so that's really not captured in any of these contracts. So my suggestion for you is, yeah, probably those records requests, maybe even just calling them and seeing if they know anything about it. But in most cases, your records requests are probably the best way to go.
Okay, and is there any, you mentioned those databases like contracts, is there any specific one that you'd recommend? I
have GovSpend, I think, is one we use. Okay. Yeah, that's been pretty good. It has a little lag in showing contracts, but it does a pretty good job when you even just search for ClearView AI. We've been finding a couple contracts pop up every kind of every week with kind of a delay on them. So we just saw like a January pop up, for example.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, we got a question from Hilda. How can people protect themselves from some of these technologies? Are there any steps people can take to provide some measure of protection for themselves? And there's an earlier question in the queue. I apologize for forgetting the name, about tactics people have to trip up face recognition.
Yeah,
I think these are really important because everyday people have ways of also exerting control over things other people design, and this is a big topic in design philosophy.
So I'll just say there's a bunch. So I'll say on two fronts. I think on one front, there's how do we protect ourselves as organizers and activists and people who are starting to learn more about this and care about this. I think specifically thinking right now, watching how it's become really quickly normalized to surveil protesters, right? If you think of all of the people protesting to reopen the government, all of the technology used to monitor where they go afterwards, it's actually very, very terrifying to think about that in the reverse setting, right? As an immigrant rights organizer organizing against ICE, what that could mean or what that could look like. So I do think that in general, we have to have heightened security protocols, and it's not just about making one little edit or like turning off your sharing thing. It is actually leave your phone at home if you're actually organizing and protesting, and we do have to internalize that and think about how we're going to approach it from that place. In terms of individual people protecting themselves, we've created a lot of different tools that exist out there, including our popular education materials that I would really encourage folks to go out there and use. You can find them at notechforice.com/pop-ed, and we'll put the links in the chat right now. But it's really hard for people to do this because there's so many sources of data, right? We were sharing about some cities like Austin. The utility company shares information with a data broker that then gets into the hands of ICE. And so if you don't click I consent, you have to choose between turning on your electricity bill and giving out your information. And so there's a bunch of different examples like that exist for people. And so I also think as much as we are trying to give people options of things they can do to be safer, again, going back to this notion of technology is safe, technology is neutral, technology will solve everything, we have to get people to understand that it is actually, we have to be hyper aware and hyper vigilant because the technology is changing constantly and they're able to have access to different things. So I think that we have to be able to think creatively about protest and think creatively about how we're pushing against deportations more broadly to be able to actually protect our community.
I have a kind of pessimistic answer. I honestly think it might be too late. I mean, something like ClearView, for example, if your photos were ever public, they've scraped those and taken them and ingested them into their database. There's really no taking that back. And there can be litigation, and that litigation will probably be fought out over the next couple of years. But there's really, I don't know what you can really do. I mean, I'm all these companies, Facebook, Twitter, Google, they've all sent cease and desist letters to ClearView, but it's unclear if they're actually even complying with those, or if that's just kind of a forward moving thing, and whatever happened in the past stays in the past. I guess moving forward, you should be more cognizant of what you post publicly. Always check your privacy settings. Yeah, but I'm super pessimistic about what's already happened. So yeah.
There's a quote by this guy Antonio Gramsci that I really like. It says optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect. And so like I try so hard not to be defeatist around it. I get what you're saying, Ryan. What do you think of the fact that California has a moratorium on face recognition and body-worn cameras, right? And then that actually got used to shut down a handheld device face recognition program that SANDAG here in San Diego had been funding since 2013. Now, having a law on the books doesn't mean anything if there aren't civil society institutions who can file lawsuits, if there aren't journalists and others who can do PRA requests to figure out what's even going on to see if you have a lawsuit, if you don't have people who are organized to kind of hold the government accountable to actually representing them. But would you disagree that at least like there could be some hope if instead of just doing our jobs, being good students and being good, designers for our clients, if we really activated the arts of citizenship and skilled ourselves up in how to make our government actually accountable to us? Democracy is just not given.
I don't think we should be like nihilistic about it, but like, yeah, I don't know if there's like a solution for like taking back what ClearView did, short of like pursuing litigation that a lot of plaintiffs are pursuing to basically get them to shut down. I don't know. Yeah, it's definitely the kind of $1 million question.
I mean, I do think I tell people we're definitely 100% in a David versus Goliath type of moment where it can feel incredibly intimidating. It can feel incredibly, scary and kind of like there isn't necessarily a hope. But I also think that we're kind of in this starting point where people are starting to understand the connections between all of these issues. I mean, if we really think about what these ginormous transnational tech and data companies are doing, right? They're transforming not only our economy, not only our democracy, and not only policing. But this isn't going to be something that we solve by having one privacy law that addresses facial recognition scanning, right? It's actually thinking about how these corporations have more power and more control and more information on us than we do. And so how do we flip the switch? And so in that, I find a lot of inspiration, because then you can say, actually, there's a very clear alliance here with, workers at Amazon who are protesting, or gig workers who are protesting, or, folks that are talking about, our right to vote and having a fair election. And so we can actually start to build, I think we're just in a political moment where we're starting to add things up, but we're starting to see that the connections go further than our issue area. And so I think our inspiration can come from we have to build very big to be able to change this. But because it's so big, we have so many allies around us. It's just actually about forming those connections and making sure that the conversation is big enough to include all of us and doesn't, again, get dominated by the same voices that, to be very honest, created the problem to begin with.
The really ironic thing here, in my view, is that I think one of the best, or at least users' best hope against something like ClearView is a Facebook or a Google or a Twitter actually enforcing their terms of service and seeing what they can do to protect their users. Like, fundamentally, you would think that Facebook has every interest in protecting the photos on its platform and making sure that something that your grandma posted or you posted from like a party in college didn't end up training, again, this facial recognition dragnet. Like, Facebook should have every interest. They should want to protect your data in this case. And so maybe there's something there, but I've been kind of watching them and asking them for doing anything. So far, they've just kind of sent letters. They haven't really committed to taking action against this company. And I felt that's just kind of bizarre.
That's interesting. Okay, so what can folks do? It sounds like, Jacinta, the way you put it, we're just starting to put the pieces together, understand how these technical and institutional systems kind of filtered through our culture work, and we're going to be working on figuring this out together for the next 10, 20 years. So everyone in the room, get it. If you're not involved already, get involved. We need you. But in the near term, what are some calls to action, things people could get involved?
I mean, there is so much that people can do to get involved. I think one, I put in the chat a little while ago, but we have a campaign website called notechforice.com where folks can find tons of resources. So if you just want to read, you just want to watch videos, you just want to learn more, that's your place to go. If you are a lawyer, a law professor, a law student, and want to sign a letter to say that Thomson Reuters and RELX should cut their ties with ICE, the sign-on letter is on that website. If you want to become just a Twitter activist, you can just go and tweet out the video against Thomson Reuters and just share it. We're trying to get as many people to share it and hashtag it before the AGM on June 3rd. So right now really is the time. So if you just want to go and go crazy. If you ever get Thomson Reuters surveys in your email, make sure to write really bad things in the comment section so that they understand that people are trying to get the message to them. So those are all kind of things that folks can do. If you're a student and want to organize on your campus, also at notechforice.com, you can sign up your campus and start to organize against recruitment. So there's tons of different opportunities there for people to participate. And I would also say if folks are Latinx and Chicanx and want Mi Gente to become part of become part of Mi Gente's political home and join forces with us, I'm going to put the link in the chat as well for people to become individual members. It's everything from No Tech for ICE to how to get Trump out of office to how we're able to build power outside of the state. So there's tons of ways for people to get involved, and those are just some suggestions. But I would just kind of put the call out, if anyone has something that they want to do against Amazon, Palantir, Thomson Reuters, Clear, these are just some of the companies that Mi Gente's kind of taken on. If you have an idea, if you have a suggestion, if you hear about a sponsorship, if anything, you want to participate, just let us know. Yeah, really interested and excited to be in conversation and in coalition with folks.
Thank you, that's really powerful. There are a couple of questions maybe to close about COVID and how does COVID and the conversation that seems to be framed around the trade-off between privacy and welfare is what one economics paper called it. You know, how does COVID change how you think about this? Maybe Paramita, you had a question. If you could maybe elaborate on that.
I think I know she's talking about. Oh.
Hey, I'm sure you already know about this, Ryan. My name is Paramita, but there was a letter written by Senator Edward Markey about COVID-19 contact tracing being used or cannot be used as cover by ClearView. And I was just wondering if you knew anything more about the role that ClearView might be playing in the development of like HHS Protect or any other things like that.
So the company has basically used COVID as kind of a marketing tool. They've gone out and done a bunch of interviews, specifically one on, I think with NBC, where CEO Juan Tontat basically said, we've been in talk with federal agencies and some state agencies to do contact tracing with ClearView. There was no follow-up, there was no asking about whether or not, what agencies those were. We've asked them as well, and they've declined to answer. So Senator Markey sent a letter in late April, basically asking what agencies were using the tool, if there are any, and because he has concerns about some of its accuracy, some of the kind of lack of oversight over it as well. But yeah, we have yet to learn if anyone's actually using it for COVID, but it's been a pretty big part of their marketing pitch lately.
All right, well, thank you so much. With that, I'm gonna wrap this up. Usually when we have physical lecture hall design at large, the panelists and speakers hang out at the front and people can
Right, yeah.
If you're up for trying that out, Ryan and Jacinta said, well, Ryan might have to leave because you've got a meeting.
I'll stay for a bit. Yeah, I can stay for a bit.
Okay, they've generously volunteered to stick around a little bit. But thank you so much for being here. Let's give a round of applause to our amazing panelists and colloquium organizers.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.
And thank you to the audience for being so engaged in the chat, engaging in each other. The art of the back channels.
Yeah, I know.